Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Well, hey, welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Happy New Year to you if this is your first episode of 2024. It's hard to believe, but yes, indeed, we are in 2024. Hey, you maybe didn't realize this, but there are show notes from every single episode. And if you simply click on the show or the episode that you're listening to and have it expand in whatever platform you're using, you'll see additional resources, links to books, links to other teachings. I'm thinking specifically of the episode last week in the conversation with Jim DeMarsh and Mark Strickland about helping a church become both word and spirit. There are lots of resources there for you to check out if you want to dig into that a little bit more. So always be sure to check the show notes if you want to go a little bit deeper into the topic that the conversation addresses. Well, in today's episode and the conversation that you're going to hear in just a moment, we are going to the furthest part of Canada on its east side. And that's the theme and the topic in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. To have this conversation, to learn more about Newfoundland and Labrador, I reached out to my friend Steve Bray. Steve is the director of Mile One Mission, and that mission's dedicated to planting churches and seeing Indigenous Newfoundlanders raised up to reach Canada's most easterly province. Steve is one of the founders of the Gospel Coalition Atlantic Canada, and he's also a founding member of the Gospel Coalition Canada, and he's on the council there. I think you'll be encouraged by this conversation with Steve. I think you'll be inspired. I know I'm inspired every time I talk to Steve. And so here we go with this conversation with pastor and elder of Calvary Baptist Church, Steve Bray. Well, Steve, welcome to the Sowers Podcast.
Thanks for having me, buddy. Been looking forward to this for a bit.
I think anybody that has met you before would probably pretty quickly say, what matters to Steve Bray? Everyone would say, well, Jesus matters to Steve Bray. His wife, his family matters to Steve Bray. But then quickly behind that, I think they would say Newfoundland, Labrador. Why do you bleed Newfoundland, Labrador? And maybe give our listeners a bit of a better understanding of what is and where is Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, it's funny. My whole pastoral life and ministry has all been wrapped up in Atlantic Canada. I'm one of those unique guys. I got a chance to pastor in Nova Scotia, pastored for a long time in Prince Edward Island, but the province I was born and raised in is Newfoundland and Labrador. And there's an expression in our culture: you can take the boy out of Newfoundland, but you can't take Newfoundland out of the boy. And that is definitely true of me. Every time I've ever visited and come back, as soon as I'm on the island, the smells, the familiarity, just the nostalgia and the loyalties all bubbles up in me. And I think that's part of, being born and raised here. And I also now think that this is something God put inside of me to want to be here, because it's not easy. It's an island. It's an island that does have a lot of ebb and flows economically and all that kind of stuff. Probably the biggest shocking reality to me, though, is what you said at the beginning, in the sense of, if anybody knows me, I pray that they would know I love Jesus, I love my family. And if you love Jesus and you love your family, and then God calls you into a certain area of ministry, then you love reaching the people God has called you to reach. And so when I moved back to Newfoundland in 2015, probably the biggest shock to me personally was what I thought I was coming back to do and what I ended up being passionate about. So I thought I was moving back to take over a small, reformish leaning conservative Baptist church. And what really took me by surprise was when I got here and started to really study my city and try to understand the needs of the city and how best could Calvary Baptist Church speak into the lives of the city. To my horror, I just didn't realize how lost my city was. And I think those first couple of years through 2015 and 2016, God just enlarged my heart as, things that I took for granted, like going to one of our wonderful tourist destinations, a place called Signal Hill, going up there and looking out over my city and just being hit with the sheer reality that the vast majority of the civilization I was looking at didn't know Jesus Christ. And it really, really motivated me. And I'm thankful along the way that my 15 years in PEI and my years in Nova Scotia, God was forming me. The people I'd come into contact with and relationship with that had influenced me all played a part in causing Steve Bray to respond to what was the burden and passion of Jesus Christ for lost people.
I'm wondering, Steve, could you share with us how you came to know Christ, how Christ rescued you? Were you born and raised in St. John's? And then maybe speak as well to some of the sensibilities that you're talking about, or the cultural realities of, the Newfoundland was in the boy. What were some of those things in your story of coming to Christ?
So the way it works in Newfoundland, if you were anywhere on the Avalon Peninsula, which is that far east part of the island and where St. John's is, the odds are in the 60s and 70s, if you were born, you were likely born in St. John's, and then you were probably raised somewhere else. So I was born in St. John's. I was raised in a little town called Harbor Grace, which is about 100 kilometers or so outside of St. John's. It's where we get the expression around the bay. So I'm from around the bay. And my parents, I'm an only child. My parents were married later in life, and my mother even had me in the 70s, even later again. She was in her 30s when she had me, which was very rare, especially in Newfoundland in the 1970s. And my parents came to Christ, surprisingly, under a Baptist influence, considering how little there was a Baptist influence in the history of our province. But in the sovereignty of God, it was an RCMP officer that witnessed to my father and my mother. And my parents came to Christ in 1977, about 2 weeks apart. And, we have another expression. Some people get saved. When my dad got saved, he got all the way saved. And so his whole life changed. My father would have said that he was a social alcoholic, that my mom and dad lived for money and partying and having a good time. And that's probably indicative considering they got married later in life and I was had later in life. So they had spent time together being single people and a couple. But man, when they got saved, it was very shortly after my parents came to Christ that mom and dad just started radically changing everything I had ever known. I went from being the king of my castle. I was the only child of older parents, and they doted on me. I had grandparents that really doted on me. And so mom and dad started taking in foster children. They turned the basement of their home into a school for kids that were mentally disabled. And when I say they took in foster kids, I mean, very quickly there was 6, 8, 7, 9 people living in our home. And so my house went from this kind of serenity now for me to absolute chaos from my perspective. And then my father decided that he wanted to become a pastor. And so, believe it or not, even though Liberty University is a household word in the Christian evangelical world today, they were so ahead of their time because my dad was actually taking correspondence courses with cassette tapes being shipped to him from Virginia as he tried to train to be a pastor. And eventually he left behind a career in the phone company and became a pastor. And so I was exposed to Christianity from the time I was 5 all the way up. Now, there is too much for a podcast like this because it's a whole testimony of my own, because we get into things about foster care and boundaries and all of these types of things. But suffice it to say, with all of that chaos being brought into our home, and I had very well-intentioned, but let's say naive parents who were brought into more of an independent, fundamental Baptist culture. So there was a lot of legalism, and there was a lot of what I would say we exerted or we projected that we were all well. Meanwhile, there could have been a lot of bad things happening behind the scenes, but you never felt safe and comfortable to admit that. And so by the time I became a teenager, I was an angry boy. I had suffered through some of the ravages of having that much chaos and confusion and hurt and brokenness in a home. And my parents didn't see it. And because I bought into the upbringing that I had, I didn't tell my parents. And so all it did was foster bitterness and anger. And so by the time I was in my mid-teens, I informed my parents that I was done with Jesus, done with the church, done with everything, which was a shock to them because I didn't say a lot to them. And so my dad, being the typical dad in the mid 1980s, said it's my way or the highway. And I chose the highway. So I ran away. Said a lot of things about my parents, the church, everything, some of which was true, most of which wasn't. And it caused a lot of harm to my family, to the reputation. The good news end of that story is my father is a consummate believer. And when in the mercy and grace of God, I was run out of options and I were nowhere left to turn and I had really made a mess of my life. My mom and dad both extended love and mercy and grace to me and took me back into their home, which gave me an opportunity to kind of express all of the things that had happened to me and around me that had affected me. And so my mom and dad took immediate steps to just give themselves to being my mom and my dad. And it really quite literally, God used their faith, their forgiveness, their mercy to save my life. Coupled with that, when I was 16, he brought this girl named Debbie Mercer into my life, who is now my wife. And I've known her since I was 5. And Debbie just had this strong faith. And so, believe it or not, we got married when I was 20. And I had really turned my life around. But it was not until I was 21 in 1993, living in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I was doing well. I mean, again, in that independent world, everything on the outside looked really put together. My wife and I were both working. We were making good money for the early 90s. We had bought our first new car. We had a beautiful apartment. And church for us was not that we were against it. It was just like, we were semi-committed. It was, we went when we went and we played the game and we said all the right things, but we kind of had fun enjoying stuff. But my mother, being the good mother that she was, called me every week and asked me 2 questions. Did you go to church and are you reading your Bible? And quite frankly, Matt, I hated her for asking me those questions. I dreaded those questions. Many times I would make up excuses, or quite frankly, I would out and out lie to her about those things. And on a Saturday evening in June of 1993, my wife and I were watching television. That was back before all of that. So all you had was cable, and we were paying big money to have the best cable we could have. In my opinion, I couldn't find anything worth watching. I was very frustrated, expressed my anger and frustration to my wife, and let that frustration and anger get the best of me, threw my television remote and said, I'm sick of this and paying all this money. I'm going to go to bed, and left my poor wife in the living room and threw myself across my bed. And wouldn't you know it, in the walk-in closet of our apartment, I saw this little bookshelf with these books because I had gone to Bible college. And on the spine of one of the books, I could see this book titled Lectures to My Students by Charles Spurgeon. And so I said, you know what, I'm bored. I said, you know what, I was feeling bad too because I had yelled at Debbie and threw the remote. So I said, you know what, I'll go to church. I'll take Debbie to church tomorrow. I'm going to pick up this book. I'm bored and angry and frustrated. I'll read some of this book. And when Mom calls me tomorrow, I can tell her I went to church and I'm reading a Christian book. Plus I've read my Bible, and that will get Mom off my back and everyone will think I'm great and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you're familiar with the book, the very first chapter of Spurgeon's book, Lectures to My Students, is paraphrasing, to be a preacher of grace, you must know grace yourself. And the whole opening of that book is about understanding, are you even a Christian? And the verse that begins the chapter is the verse from James 1, which says, are you a hearer of the word? Are you a doer of the word, or just a hearer of the word? And he unpacks what it means to look into a mirror and then go and forget. And whatever it was, in God's mercy, it was like my entire life just flashed before me. And I argued with God on that bed for several hours. And my conversion experience is not one of some proposition or sinner's prayer. I quite frankly just said to God, I am sick of this. You know I'm a sinner. I know I'm a sinner. I got nothing to offer. I got no cool little prayer to give. But you have to be real. And I'm either going to get off this bed and go live a life of debauchery and die. And I went all Clint Eastwood Western and I'll see you in hell, or you're going to transform my life and I'm going to get off this bed and my life is never going to be the same.
Mm.
And God just allowed me to get off that bed and be transformed by his grace.
Praise God. Praise God. Could you share with us? I want to transition a little bit to, I mean, we could talk broadly about Atlantic Canada, but I want to hone in on Newfoundland and Labrador. What would you say are three things that are cultural realities in Newfoundland and Labrador that would be distinct or different from the rest of Canada?
Yeah. So number one is just the sheer age of it. I mean, where I live is over 500 years old, and it was almost founded religiously. So the only similarity that I can think of in Canada would be with Quebec, and because of the deep entrenched understanding of Catholicism and then Anglicanism, and just the back and forth between those and the history of the city and region I was raised in. And then along that came along kind of the United Church of Canada. But barring that, from like the late 1400s all the way up to the late 1800s, that was the dominant religious presence, Catholicism and Anglicanism. It wasn't until 1898, when William Booth sent his first couple from England, that the Salvation Army got established here in the province, and not just established as a church, like a functional church with buildings and steeples and crosses and services, and functioning as a church in every way we think of when we think church. And then in the early 1900s, a lady that was a convert at the Azusa Street revivals brought what we now know as the Pentecostal Assemblies of Newfoundland and Labrador. So pre 1898, but yet for 300 plus years, there was this religious mindset here, but it was largely institutional, and that institution was wrapped up in its culture and its politics and everything. So age and religious institutionalism. Then outside of those two things, the third thing would be just the sheer isolation of it being an island. And so we are influenced and affected by everything in Upper Canada and the mainland and the United States and the world and all those kinds of things. But anything that influences still, in some ways, I use the word metastasizes and takes on a life of its own, and still somehow must bow down to the culture that is Newfoundland. So Newfoundland is this wonderfully hospitable, humorous, friendly, look out for each other kind of collection of people, mixed with this fierce, proud, we have survived where nobody else has or was willing. We have a way of doing things. You're not going to force your ways on us. So there's this collision of niceness and yet proud strength that collides. And that affects every aspect of the way of life here.
Mm-hmm. I remember last year, or I guess it's this year, I did a trip out to the East Coast and came to visit you, but first stopped in Halifax on the way. And I didn't realize because when you look at a map, it's not always accurate this way, but the trip for me to fly from Toronto to Halifax was the same length of time for me to get from Halifax out to St. John's. So you really come to realize it's out there. I think probably some people might be familiar with Newfoundland from the Broadway show Come From Away, which emphasizes that friendliness. How would you say, those three things you touched on have impacted the spiritual climate in Newfoundland and Labrador? Something that we've connected over is my wife was born in Newfoundland, and her family background was Pentecostal. And so I certainly knew that there was a strong Pentecostal history in Newfoundland. And then hearing now you talking about the Anglican and Catholic Church, but what has been the impact of even those internal Christian presences colliding on now the spiritual climate within Newfoundland?
Yeah. So when I put it in a sentence, we are practically secular, like we are seeing happen in Canada and the US and other parts of the world, in Europe and places as well. But we are still culturally religious. And because we're isolated, and because religion has been such a part of just the very existence of Newfoundland and Labrador, that's not something you just turn on and off. And it's taking much longer to kind of flush through Newfoundland as it has already seemingly flushed through areas of Canada. And so it could very well be that I meet many people my age and younger that have no desire for church, very rarely, if ever, darken the door of a church, but on some level of respect, on some level of identity, on some level of their own Newfoundlander and Labradorianness, still will, oh, but I am Catholic, or I am Pentecostal, or I am Salvation Army, or I am this, even though practically everyday life, that means nothing. The other thing about Newfoundlanders that makes it very difficult sometimes from an outsider looking in is that, although when I explain this, many people live it, is that we can make fun of ourselves, and we can even make fun of the religion kind of we've been attached to by our family surname, but nobody else can. So there is a lot of humor in Newfoundland. We mock ourselves, we mock religion, we mock politics, we mock all kinds of stuff. But for other people to do it, or even other Newfoundlanders, so if you were raised Pentecostal and you mock Catholicism, that's taboo. Like you've crossed the line. If you've been raised Catholic and you make fun of Pentecostalism, that's crossing the line. That's disrespectful. It's not just that you're mocking a church, you're mocking a family. You're mocking personal choices. And so it's this weird tension that if you just are in the city living it out, I don't think you would feel that St. John's is much different than living in Halifax or in Ottawa or, some of those 200 to 400,000 person cities or population bases. But once you start to engage in conversation, now, I will say one tipping point that is changing it a little bit and yet playing into the cultural hands of it is immigration. So we are starting to see a massive influx of people that are coming now from not other parts of Canada, other parts of the world, and they're starting to bring. So we've been introduced in the last few years to religions and philosophies and ways of life that would have just been something we've read about or learned about or watching a movie or saw a show. But now they're here in our streets, they're in restaurants, they're in places and businesses. So Hinduism and Islam and the Baha'i and just other philosophies and ways of looking at life are not just things you hear about, but they're actually setting up, and there's pockets of people that would adhere to this, believe in this, practice this. And so that's challenging. However, on the flip side, a lot of the immigrants that are coming, if they come from Africa, if they come from certain Asian countries, they've actually already been highly influenced by either Catholicism or the charismatic, I won't even say Pentecostalism, but charismaticism. And so when they come to Newfoundland, they largely look for a Catholic church or a Pentecostal church. If they're coming from other parts of Asia or the Middle East, and they want to figure out, well, what does Canada worship? Then they look for steeples and crosses. So it is this weird thing that both pushes the cultural paradigm ahead and yet still paralyzes Newfoundland's culture in its place. And that affects even how we look at witnessing, church planting, engaging the city and all that kind of stuff. Because unlike many other places that are far more progressive, us here in Newfoundland, Calvary Baptist, having bought a Roman Catholic church and having a church that looks like a church with a steeple, with a cross, has actually given us massive amounts of credibility in the overall populace of the city and driven a lot more people to come visit us versus, people that just have a warehouse or they meet in a theater. That's been done here and honestly has failed over and over again because it doesn't fit the cultural understanding of what church should be if you're interested in it.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Steve in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Mile One Mission. Mile One Mission wants to see gospel-centered churches raised up from St. John's to Bonavista, Gander to Clarenville, Salmon Cove to Upper Middle Cove, from Port Aux Basques to St. Anthony, and from GooseBay to Nain. As Jesus said, go, in Matthew 28:19-20, it is our conviction to be his witness. And then from Acts 1:8, to proclaim the gospel, Luke 24, verse 47, and see the kingdom come. If you want to learn more about Mile One Mission, you can go to mileonemission.ca. Mile One Mission also has a podcast called Rugged Theology, and it was started by Mile One Mission staff in 2020. Once again, if you want to learn more about Mile One Mission, you can visit mileonemission.ca. newfoundlandmission.ca. And now back to my interview with Steve Bray. Maybe help us understand a bit of the population. I remember watching a CBC clip, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, and they were talking about some of the challenges that were being faced in different rural communities of Newfoundland and Labrador, and that there were still places that people lived that were only accessible, by ships to get to. And so the government at one point said, listen, we don't want to send this ship in the winter anymore. So, we'll pay you to relocate to other areas of our province. I'm assuming many of those little rural communities were fishing villages at one point. There's a movie called The Grand Seduction, which is about one of these little fishing villages that's trying to convince this doctor to come and live with them. But just explain a bit of that to us as far as population density. Obviously, you have the density around St. John's, but then what is it in these other little pockets? And how does that make getting the gospel out to Newfoundland and Labrador unique?
Yeah. So I again, maybe on a more intense level, but yet I actually think it's pretty representative of our whole country. If anybody takes the time to do a study of Canada, we just crossed over, I think this year, the 40 million mark. And yet, if you were to take, I think, our 10 capital cities from starting in Newfoundland, going to British Columbia, and you added up all their population, the vast, vast majority of that 40 million is represented in those 10 capital cities. In Newfoundland, it might just be a little bit more exasperated. So you're talking about a province with, depending on what website you go to and depending on when you go to it, somewhere between, say, 527,000 to as much as 540,000. And yet somewhere between 225 and 250,000 of that is what we would call the St. John's municipal regional area. And definitely close to 250 to 300,000 is on the Avalon Peninsula. So that one little kind of claw looking thing right at the end of Newfoundland and Labrador. There's only 30-odd thousand in all of Labrador, which is actually geographically larger than Newfoundland. And the other 160 to 175,000 is spread out across 500 miles by 700 miles. And much of that is, like you said, peppered along the coast because it was largely a fishing area. The evolution, so to speak, or the maturation and with modern technology, so the oil and gas industry, now wind energy and all of this type of stuff has definitely, it's reworking the map. So what's happening is when you're in St. John's is unemployment rate, I think, is less than the Canadian national average. Its education rate is far, far higher than the rest of the province. In fact, the post-secondary education rate of St. John's rivals that of the rest of Atlantic Canada, and in many cases is ahead of it. The median salary here and stuff like that. Then you go to Labrador, where everything in Labrador, in the main parts of GooseBay, Lab City, they're basically boom towns. They're towns built off of natural resources, whether that be hydroelectric dam, iron ore, nickel, and so on and so forth. But the rest are centuries old, have existed off the land, obviously in Labrador with the influence too of the Innu and the Inuit and so on and so forth, and the rest of Newfoundland with fishing and forestry and stuff like that. So yet what is amazing is that most evangelicalism had its biggest influence in rural Newfoundland and up on the shores of Labrador, not in the city of St. John's. So the greatest concentration of the Pentecostal church in Newfoundland or the Salvation Army church in Newfoundland is actually outside the city. And that's what drove my burden for Mile One Mission and why we needed to plant more churches in St. John's is if you look at the stats, I think for the Pentecostal Assemblies of Newfoundland, they would say right now they have somewhere between 90 and 95 churches as a total denomination. But there's only 5 within the city limits of St. John's. And yet this is where almost 50% of your population is. So you have fishing villages out in the central part of Newfoundland where you could have in a community with 600, 800, 1,000 people, and 200 or 300 of them attend a Pentecostal church. And so that's where you have it. Now, spin that forward 150 years now, 140 years. But what you now have with the watering down and that's true of evangelical, whether it's Baptist, Pentecostal, non-denom, whatever, we have all seen a watering down of the gospel. We've all seen a cheapening of the gospel. It's, did you say a sinner's prayer? Did you do this? Did you do that? And yet an abandoning of orthodoxy, a loss of spiritual disciplines that weren't legalistically driven. And so you've got this syncretism happening here like you have everywhere else. It's magnified in the city of St. John's. The biggest challenge to bringing a robust gospel to the rest of Newfoundland and Labrador is not the lack of people that haven't heard even some form of a gospel presentation. It's their understanding and view of God and the Bible and how it applies to today that I think is really hurting, which is why we're finding as we do things here, the surprising, shocking thing to us is we're actually attracting more young adults over every other demographic. 18 to 28 is the largest demographic of our church. It seems to be the demographic most interested in where we're trying to plant churches. It seems to be the group of people that are the most open to real dialogue. They're the most honest. They're the least influenced by a set of traditions. They're the most desperate. Everybody else, like, to be honest with you, my age and older, I find are some of the hardest people for me to engage with in my own province because we still have that old schoolness still attached to us.
Mm-hmm. So now let's transition to that very reality. In 2015, you come and you anticipate that you're, the mission is, hey, I'm going to take over this little Baptist church and we'll kind of have some fun. You talked in the beginning of our conversation of going up on Signal Hill, to our listeners, if you ever get a chance to go to St. John's, you need to go to Signal Hill. But you end up at Signal Hill looking out over your city and going, wow, this place needs Jesus. So what you started creating something called Mile One Mission. So share with us what the vision and mission of Mile One Mission is.
Well, thankfully, God has brought people in my life that took me on both a theological journey, but a missiological journey. And, being around church since I was 5, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I've always been a guy that, people say the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so I thank the Lord that he brought both men and women and ideas and books and movements into my life that caused me to think and ask questions. And when I discovered that Jesus is actually okay with questions and expects us to come to him. So when I moved back to St. John's, I started to do something that often I've never done. I just got wrapped up in my own bubble, my own church, my own little circle. But I then started to, reach out to every church in the city. I started to try to have as many conversations with leaders of those churches and actually ask them, hey, can I come see your church? Can we go out for coffee? Can I buy you a meal? And get them talking, get their story, and then find out, like, so how many people come to your church and why are you in ministry and what are the challenges of you being here in St. John's? And then I expanded that, started talking to police chiefs and social workers and principals. I started meeting with government people and trying to travel around and look at other things. And then, when I moved here, I found out there was a mosque had been built here and there was a Jewish synagogue that had always been here, but I'd never seen it, never went near it, because in my tradition, I was kind of taught you stay in your world and don't expand. So the more I learned, the more I talked, the more I did these coffees and dinner dates and lunch dates and went out and saw these buildings, the more I found out that we have a lot fewer buildings than we think we do, and many of them are empty or in decline. And so when I started talking and started adding up, and I put basically all the Catholic churches in a row, I put all the Anglican churches, I put all the United churches, and then I had this category called loosely evangelical. So I put all Salvation Army churches, Pentecostal churches, Baptist churches, any non-denom. And then I put, churches that are, this is not to be disparaging, just like another category where I could put, whether it was non-denom, whether it was Baha'i, whatever it might be. And when I looked at it all, and then I said, okay, they actually have a serving priest, a serving minister, serving pastor. And when I talk to them, what do they tell me their membership is, their average attendance is? Are they happy, sad? Do they feel encouraged? All of these things. Well, and the category where I put evangelical, well, in 2015 into 2016, that number was 22 churches with a combined average weekly attendance of about 22 to 2,300 people. So then I went and did the census and drew a circle around St. John's as what was called the St. John's Regional Municipality. And when, depending on how big you make your circle, I made it about 30 kilometers, I think. And inside that circle was 250,000 people. And I was horrified. I was like, so less than 1% of my city even attends any church that would call itself evangelical. And then when I started to add in, okay, so now if I add in every Catholic church, so we have a Catholic church there that holds over 2,000, and yet most of the time, the average attendance of a mass is 100. We have an Anglican cathedral that I think holds 1,000 to 1,500, and they're thankful if they crack 35 or 40 at a service. I went to United Church in a new up-and-coming neighborhood that is a newer church, met with the person there that looks after the church, and they said, oh, Steve, listen, if we crack 30, that's a good Sunday. Like, I go home pumped. And yet the church, the sanctuary alone was almost 4,000 square feet. I think had 600 chairs in it. And then I found out that the Salvation Army churches, the Pentecostal churches, had all lost anywhere from 30 to 50% of their average weekly attendance in the last decade. And that's what prompted me to go, okay, I understand we're living in a time, I understand a sense of liberal theology, I understand all of that, but could it be that we've lost our way even with our methodology and our paradigm of how we're actually going to engage with people? Because even in my Baptist world, as Baptists, we're known for bigger is better. I honestly think we gave birth to the megachurch, and this idea that destination, one-stop shopping, almost like Walmart church. Like you come to that spot, it's everything. And yet, when I looked at the cultural nuance of Newfoundland, our historical background, the way we were populated, the way we relate to each other, the more and more I studied it, the more and more it cried out to me neighborhoods. And the idea of intimacy and relationship, the idea of time, the idea of what does vulnerability, transparency, accountability really look like? And so that's where God started taking me on a journey. And then I came across a church planting network called 20 Schemes, which is based in Scotland. I went over there on a vision trip, and when I was there, I was like, this is like I'm in Newfoundland. The way that people talk, the sarcasm, the humor, the intensity of the relationships, the intensity of the fights and the love just resonated. And so I learned everything I could from that, and I brought a lot of that back here to St. John's with me. And we started down a journey of not looking to build bigger, flashier churches. And I hear my heart in the sense that that's not meant as a criticism. That is meant as how are we going to effectively reach Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, especially in the capital city of St. John's, with the gospel? And so our burden, our paradigm was to bring back the true essence of a neighborhood church, where you would build a church within a neighborhood. Everyone there would live there. They would really look out for each other and seek to influence. And so the question, Matt, that I posed to my leadership after about 18 to 24 months, I asked them this question: what would be better for St. John's, a church of 2,000 or 10 churches of 200 spread across the city, embedded in neighborhoods, representing the neighborhoods they were in, reaching those neighborhoods, influencing those neighborhoods, and where those 10, 11 churches truly loved each other, they weren't in competition with each other, they weren't franchises. It wasn't, setting up McDonald's in different neighborhoods, but actually that each church would reflect the people they were trying to reach. And it took us a good 6 months, but after a lot of prayer, a lot of reading, a lot of meetings, the leadership of the church finally coalesced that the answer to that question was 10 churches of 200 would have much more of an impact in St. John's than a single church of 2,000. And then from 2019 to will be our 5th anniversary next year, we sought to live out that and create that as our vision and as our goal to, Lord willing, one day see 10 churches plus Calvary strategically located in neighborhoods across the city.
Mm-hmm. And so to date, you have Kilbride Community Church. You have a leader working on Downtown Community Church. You have the vision of the future of Rabbittown Community Church. And I think also in the middle here, you have other churches in other parts of the province that have gotten hold of the vision. So share with us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, so I have a friend, a very dear family friend that goes back a lot of years. He's a little older than me. That is a very highly respected medical doctor in GooseBay, Happy Valley GooseBay in Labrador. He reached out to me because they had tried for a long period of time to establish a gospel witness in that community. In one of a rare case, they have a beautiful facility, but again, you talk about isolation, you talk about, cultural collisions, because you've got First Nations, you've got Boomtown, you've got Americans and Canadians and basically people from all around the world, because you're dealing with oil and gas. So it's just this hodgepodge. You're talking about expensive economics. So you've got a lot of money with isolation. So which means you've got a lot of sin, addictive behavior and stuff like that. And so, but God in his sovereignty brought this man to us from Biloxi, Mississippi, and who just moved up here through COVID, just falling in love with our culture and with our people and us with them. And yeah, next month in January, he moves up to GooseBay and will replant, relaunch, restart Northern Cross Community Church in GooseBay. And over the last 2 years, it's expanded our vision to include about 5 or 6 other sites of population bases strategically spread across Newfoundland and one other place in Labrador. So the ultimate desire that we go to God with now is, if over the next 10 years, God would allow us to see another 10, 11, 12 churches started, to bring us somewhere between 15 and 17, 10, 11 of which are in St. John's, and another 7 or so that are spread across Newfoundland and Labrador. And so that's where that's come. So yeah, we have Northern Cross and Kilbride will start having weekly services next year. Our downtown church plant is having a regular weekly Bible study, and Lord willing, in 2024, we'll be able to start having monthly services. And then our next assessed church planter, Lord willing, will start the gathering process of moving into Rabbittown, which is a very strategic neighborhood next to our university, and Lord willing, starting a Bible study, or just getting into that neighborhood, finding out what the DNA of that neighborhood is. And then, so for us, a pattern's always been, we move in a send team, which in an ideal situations is a planter family. We try to get a male and female intern that we can raise the money for and support, and they move in to the neighborhood with the planter. So that's our send team. And their job is, over the next 24 months, live in the neighborhood, study the neighborhood, love on the neighborhood, discover the identity of the neighborhood, the ebbs and flows, the weaknesses, the strengths, all of that, just become a part of that. From that, build enough relationship and trust to start a Bible study, being people's homes, being hospitable, being out in the neighborhood and neighborhood type events. And then from there, Lord willing, start to host maybe monthly gatherings if there's enough people that want to do that. And then bi-weekly gatherings. And then we don't call a church plant. So when I use the word plant, I mean it literally, that we've planted a seed in that. For us, it's not an established church. And next level, we call it launch. And that could take up to 3 years for us, even more. And launch for us means that there's a send team with a core team, that they've got the critical mass to justify and actually bring positive influence on their neighborhood, to host regular Sunday services as an overflow of what they're doing throughout the week in the neighborhood anyway.
Mm-hmm. Steve, just as we close, what are a couple of things that our listeners can be praying for you and for Mile One Mission about?
So number one, like anything, I think like every other mission and initiative, coming out of COVID, all the economics, the inflation, our model is very different from a lot of models. We try to raise all the money. We try to get all the support. We try not to pass that pressure onto our planters and interns. So obviously, just that God would have us find favor with individuals or churches that would like to partner with us. But the second thing is, we've had some pretty rapid growth from a Newfoundland perspective and a Canadian perspective. And just that we would, stay humble, stay desperate, not get our eyes off the prize, not feel like we've got a gimmick now that we're running with. I don't want to be a car salesman, and I don't want to be an infomercial. I want this to be for God's glory, for his kingdom. We have a sweatshirt, Matt, that we have adopted a saying by Count Zinzendorf, who started the Moravian missions movement. And it was preach the gospel, die and be forgotten. And we've put that on our sweatshirt, and we wear that often. The humble passion to just do what we feel God's called us to do in this province, and not that we're trying to come up with some cool new thing that can take over the rest of North America.
Mm-hmm. Steve, thanks for taking the time today to be on the Sowers Podcast.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it so much.
Well, I'm sure you would agree that there is much from my conversation with Steve that you could apply as an action step. The thing that I want to bring focus or emphasis to, however, is Steve's analysis of his city. He began to look at the city of St. John's and ask the question, how many people are actually involved in the life of local churches? How many Christians are there truly in this city? As he did that analysis, as he began to collect those statistics, his heart was therefore burdened because of the amount of lostness that was in his city. His vision for his region expanded because he saw the need that was there. Maybe this is an exercise that you could do of asking the question, how many people in my city are actually engaged with local churches? How many are not? And what does that reveal about the lostness of your particular city and of your region? As you come to terms with that number, as you come to terms with those realities, my prayer is that then your heart would be burdened to have a greater vision than you could ever imagine, and that you would begin praying towards that end and praying for their then methods that you might use to reach and to become a sower in these places. Well, once again, everyone, thank you for listening to this episode and this conversation. You're now going to hear a clip from a conversation that will be released next week that I have with Bert and Sheila Thompson as we talk about the impacts of church planting on marriage and family life. You're not going to want to miss it.
During that time, I can remember our youngest laying on the couch. He's very outgoing personality, probably the most extroverted out of our 4 kids. And he was very sullen, and he was on the couch. And I just said, hey, little buddy, you okay? He said, I'm okay, Dad. I'm just grieving the loss of what this move means. And I thought, wow, I think this is much better. Somehow he had figured out through how we were treating him that he would need to grieve the loss of his friends and the move along the way.